Aldrics Healing.
France, 1918.
Isabel Hartley sat outside the field hospital, exhausted, rubbing her hands through the dirt. Then she froze. Beneath her fingertips, a name had been scratched into the earth. Samuel Hayes. But she hadn't written it. Chapter 1. The name in the dirt. The air hung thick and heavy, a suffocating blend of antiseptic, blood, and the ever-present scent of damp earth. Isabel Hartley sat on a low, overturned crate just outside the canvas flaps of the field hospital, the coarse fabric scratching against her already irritated skin. May 1918. The relentless spring rain had finally ceased, leaving behind a world steeped in mud and misery. She rubbed her hands, ingrained with the grime of the day, absently through the soil, a futile attempt to ground herself, to feel something other than the bone-deep exhaustion that had become her constant companion. Her fingers traced patterns in the damp earth, a mindless act, a distraction from the screams that still echoed faintly from within the tent. Another wave of casualties had arrived from the latest offensive near Amiens, boys barely old enough to shave, their bodies torn apart by the relentless machinery of war. She'd spent the last 16 hours straight assisting the surgeons, holding down thrashing limbs, staunching bleeding wounds, whispering hollow comforts to men who would never see their homes again. Then she froze. Her fingertips encountered a resistance, a series of deliberate grooves in the earth. Not the random scratches of a passing animal, but something intentional. She brushed away the loose soil, her heart beginning to pound a heavy, uneven rhythm against her ribs. Letters began to emerge, formed with a crude, desperate hand. Samuel Hayes. The name slammed into her with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She stared at it, disbelief warring with a sickening wave of what? Hope.
Dread? It couldn't be.
Samuel Hayes was a ghost, a phantom from a past she had painstakingly buried, a life she had forced herself to forget. A life before the war, before the endless parade of mangled bodies, before the numbing routine that had become her shield against the unrelenting horror. Isabel traced the letters again, her fingertip lingering on the final S. The soil was still damp here, indicating the inscription was recent. Hours, perhaps. Not days. But Samuel was dead. She had seen the telegram herself, the stark, official words that had shattered her world 2 years ago. Regret to inform you Sergeant Samuel Hayes killed in action. Somme. She closed her eyes. The image of that telegram, the crisp paper, the black ink, burned into her memory. The crushing grief, the hollow emptiness that had followed. The guilt, the weight of unspoken words, of unfulfilled promises. She had mourned him, grieved him, forced herself to move on, to find solace in the relentless demands of her work, burying her pain beneath the layers of suffering she witnessed every day. But now this, a name scratched in the dirt, a whisper from beyond the grave. Or was it? Could it be a cruel coincidence? Another Samuel Hayes? There must be hundreds, thousands of men with that name. Common enough. And yet a shiver ran down her spine, a primal instinct screaming that this was no coincidence. She looked around, her gaze sweeping across the chaotic scene. Orderlies rushed past, carrying stretchers laden with groaning men. Nurses, their faces drawn and pale with fatigue, hurried between the tents, their aprons stained with blood. No one seemed to notice her, a lone figure sitting in the mud, staring at a name. A name that had resurrected a past she thought was long dead. The wind picked up, swirling dust and the acrid smell of smoke from a nearby burning pile of discarded bandages. Isabel pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, a sudden chill settling deep in her bones. It wasn't just the wind. It was a feeling, a premonition, a sense of something unfinished. She had to know. She had to find out who had written this name and why. The logical part of her brain, the part that had learned to compartmentalize, to detach, to survive, told her to ignore it, to dismiss it as a cruel trick of the light, a figment of her exhausted imagination. But the other part, the part that still held onto the faintest ember of hope, the part that had loved Samuel Hayes with a fierce, unwavering devotion, refused to let go. She stood up, her legs stiff and aching from hours of standing. She brushed the dirt from her skirt, a futile gesture in this mud-soaked landscape. She had to find the ward master, inquire about any new arrivals. Any man named Samuel Hayes. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but she couldn't ignore it. The name in the dirt, a silent cry in the wilderness, had stirred something within her, a flicker of life in the desolate landscape of her heart. As she turned towards the entrance of the hospital tent, a sudden sound made her pause. A low moan, coming from the shadows behind a stack of supply crates. She hesitated, torn between her urgent need to find answers and the ingrained instinct to help those in need. Duty, as always, won. She moved cautiously towards the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows were deep, obscuring whatever lay hidden there. As she drew closer, the moaning grew louder, accompanied by a ragged, gasping breath. She rounded the crates and found him. A young soldier, his uniform caked in mud and blood, lay huddled on the ground, his face pale and drawn with pain. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and labored. He was clutching his abdomen, his fingers stained crimson. He looked heartbreakingly young, another victim of this senseless war. Isabel knelt beside him, her own anxieties momentarily forgotten in the face of his immediate need. "Can you hear me?" she asked softly, her voice calm and reassuring. "What's your name, soldier?" He opened his eyes, his gaze unfocused, clouded with pain. He tried to speak, but only a choked whisper escaped his lips. She leaned closer, straining to hear. He whispered a name, barely audible, yet it cut through Isabel like a shard of glass. A name that echoed the one scratched in the dirt, a name that shattered the fragile remnants of her composure. A name that would change everything. Chapter 2. Whispers of a Ghost. The name he whispered was not Samuel. It was Help Hayes. A plea, choked and desperate, clinging to the edge of consciousness. Isabel's mind raced, the implications of the whispered words colliding with the overwhelming reality of the wounded soldier before her. It wasn't him, but it was about him, or someone connected to him. She quickly assessed his injuries. A deep, ragged wound in his abdomen, bleeding profusely. He was losing blood fast. She needed to get him inside to the surgeons.
Now.
"I'm here," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm going to help you. Just hold on." She pressed her hand against the wound, trying to stem the flow of blood. "Orderly," she shouted, her voice echoing across the muddy expanse. "Orderly, we need a stretcher here."
Now.
2 orderlies, alerted by her urgent call, came running. They carefully lifted the young soldier onto a stretcher, their movements practiced and efficient. Isabel followed them into the tent, her mind still reeling.
Hayes.
The name echoed in her head, a persistent whisper that refused to be silenced. The hospital tent was a cacophony of sound and smell. The air was thick with the coppery tang of blood, the sharp sting of antiseptic, and the underlying odor of unwashed bodies and decaying flesh. Groans and cries of pain filled the air, punctuated by the clatter of surgical instruments and the hurried whispers of nurses and doctors. Isabel guided the orderlies to an empty operating table. Dr. Moreau, the head surgeon, a gruff but skilled Frenchman with weary eyes and hands stained with countless battles, approached immediately. He quickly examined the soldier, his expression grim. "Severe abdominal trauma," he muttered, more to himself than to Isabel. "Lost a lot of blood. We need to operate immediately." He turned to Isabel. "Nurse Hartley, prepare him for surgery."
And pray.
Isabel nodded, her mind already racing through the necessary steps. She cleaned the wound, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, her thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The soldier's whispered plea, the name in the dirt, the memory of Samuel, it was all connected, somehow. She felt it in her gut, a deep, unsettling certainty. As she worked, she noticed a small, leather-bound book tucked inside the soldier's tunic, partially soaked with blood. She carefully extracted it, her fingers brushing against the damp leather. It was a diary. She hesitated, knowing it was an invasion of privacy, but something compelled her to open it. The first page was inscribed with a name and a regimental number. Private Thomas Baker, 12th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers. So, not Samuel. But the diary might hold a clue. She flipped through the pages, scanning the hurried, often illegible handwriting. Most of the entries were mundane accounts of daily life in the trenches, the endless rain, the mud, the rats, the constant fear of shelling. But then a few pages in she found it. May 8th. Still no word from Sergeant Hayes. He went out on patrol 3 days ago, beyond the wire. Said he had a feeling. A hunch. He wouldn't say more. Just that it was important. Something he had to do. I hope he's all right.
He's a good man, Hayes. The best.
Isabel's heart skipped a beat. Sergeant Hayes. The same rank. The same regiment as Samuel. Could it be? Could this be the same Samuel Hayes she had believed dead? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. She continued reading, her eyes devouring the words. May 9th. Still no sign of Hayes. The rumors are flying. Some say he was captured. Others say he deserted. I don't believe it. Not Hayes. He wouldn't. He couldn't. May 10th. We were attacked this morning. A massive barrage. I was hit. Don't know how bad. Everything is blurry. I heard someone shouting Hayes' name. Thought I saw him, but it couldn't be. The entry ended abruptly, the handwriting trailing off into an illegible scrawl. The rest of the pages were blank. Isabel closed the diary, her hands trembling. The pieces were starting to fall into place, forming a picture that was both terrifying and strangely hopeful. Samuel alive? It seemed impossible. And yet the diary, the whispered plea, the name in the dirt, it all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. The surgery was long and arduous. Dr. Moreau worked tirelessly, his brow furrowed in concentration, his hands moving with a surgeon's precision. Isabel assisted him, her own anxieties pushed aside by the immediate need to save the young soldier's life. Hours later, as the first rays of dawn filtered through the canvas flaps of the tent, Dr. Moreau finally straightened up, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion. He's stable, he said, his voice hoarse. But it was close. Very close. He's a lucky young man. Isabel let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She looked down at Private Baker, his face pale and gaunt, but his chest rising and falling with a steady rhythm. He was alive. And he might hold the key to finding Samuel. As she cleaned up the operating table, her gaze fell on the diary again. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the worn leather. She knew she had to find out more. She had to find out what had happened to Sergeant Hayes. She had to find out if the man she had loved, the man she had mourned, was still alive. The whispers of a ghost had led her to this point, and she wouldn't rest until she had uncovered the truth. She owed it to Samuel. She owed it to herself. The weariness was there, heavy on her frame, but something else now propelled. A thread of hope, tenuous but strong, anchored in the name scratched upon the earth. Chapter 3. The Unsent Letter. Isabel found a quiet corner in the bustling hospital, a small, alcove-like space usually reserved for storing linens. The rising sun cast long shadows, painting the canvas walls with a muted, golden light. The sounds of the hospital, the groans of the wounded, the clatter of instruments, the hurried footsteps seemed distant here, muffled by the thick fabric. She sat on a stack of folded blankets, Private Baker's diary clutched to her hands, and a new, almost frantic determination hardening her resolve. She needed more information. She needed to find someone who knew Sergeant Hayes, someone who could confirm her increasingly desperate hope. But where to start? The 12th Battalion, they were likely still in the area, but the front lines were fluid, constantly shifting. Finding them would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. Then she remembered. The unsent letters. Every soldier who came through the hospital, if they were conscious and able, was encouraged to write a letter home. Those who were too injured, or those who didn't make it, their letters were collected, their personal effects inventoried, and, if possible, sent to their families. It was a grim task, one that Isabel had often assisted with, the weight of each unopened letter heavy in her hands. She knew where they were kept. In a locked wooden chest in the administrative tent, a small, cramped space that served as the hospital's makeshift office. She would need to get the key. The ward master, a stern, no-nonsense woman named Madame Dubois, kept it on a chain around her neck, a constant reminder of the responsibility she carried. Isabel found Madame Dubois in the main ward, overseeing the distribution of the morning rations. She was a formidable figure, tall and imposing, with a sharp gaze that seemed to see everything. Approaching her was always a daunting task, but Isabel knew she had no choice. "Madame Dubois," she said, her voice respectful but firm. "I need to access the chest of unsent letters." Madame Dubois looked at her, her eyebrows raised in a silent question. "And why is that, Nurse Hartley?" Isabel hesitated. She couldn't reveal the true reason for her request. Not yet. It was too personal, too fragile. I believe there may be a letter from a soldier who was brought in earlier," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Private Thomas Baker. He mentioned a relative. I want to see if he wrote to them." It was a partial truth, a necessary deception. Madame Dubois studied her for a moment, her gaze unwavering. Isabel held her breath, praying that she wouldn't see through her carefully constructed facade. Finally, Madame Dubois nodded. "Very well," she said, "but be quick. And be careful. Those letters are precious." She reached into her pocket and produced the key, handing it to Isabel with a warning look. "Don't lose it." Isabel thanked her and hurried to the administrative tent. The chest was located in a corner, beneath a pile of paperwork and medical supplies. It was heavy, made of dark, polished wood, with a sturdy brass lock. She inserted the key and turned it, the mechanism clicking open with a resounding sound. The chest was filled with letters, hundreds of them, each one a testament to love, loss, and longing. The air inside was thick with the scent of paper and ink, a faint, lingering perfume of hope and despair. Isabel began to search, her fingers moving quickly through the stacks of envelopes, her heart pounding in her chest. She sorted the letters by regiment, then by date. The 12th Battalion, there were dozens of letters from them, a grim reminder of the constant fighting, the relentless toll of the war. She scanned the names, her eyes searching for any mention of Hayes. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the tent. Isabel's eyes were tired, her back ached, but she couldn't stop. She had to find something. Anything. Then she saw it. A letter, slightly crumpled and stained with mud, addressed in a familiar, bold handwriting. A handwriting she hadn't seen in 2 years, but one she would recognize anywhere. To Miss Isabel Hartley, Rose Cottage, Sussex, England. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Samuel's handwriting. The letter was unsent, unopened. She carefully extracted it from the chest, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold it. She stared at the envelope, her name written in a strong, confident hand, a ghost from the past reaching out to touch her. She hesitated, her heart torn between the overwhelming desire to tear it open and the fear of what it might contain. What if it was a farewell letter? What if it confirmed her worst fears? But she couldn't leave it unread. She had to know. With trembling fingers, she carefully tore open the envelope. The paper inside was thin and fragile, yellowed with age. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words, her heart pounding in her chest. It was dated June 15, 1916, just days before he was reported killed. The words blurred before her eyes, but one sentence, near the end, stood out stark and clear, shattering the fragile hope that had been building within her. A sentence that made her question everything she thought she knew. Chapter 4. A Face in the Flames. The sentence that leapt from the page was not a declaration of love, nor a farewell. It was a question, a desperate plea scrawled in the hurried hand of a man facing his own mortality. If you receive this, Isabel, know that I am not who you think I am. I have a duty, a secret that I can no longer keep. Forgive me. Isabel read the sentence again and again, the words burning themselves into her memory. Not who you think I am. What did it mean? What secret could be so terrible, so profound, that it would make him question their entire relationship? The letter offered no further explanation. It was filled with the usual wartime sentiments, longing for home, descriptions of the horrors he had witnessed, expressions of love and affection for her. But those words now seemed hollow, tainted by the shadow of his confession. She sank back against the stack of blankets, the letter clutched in her hand, her mind reeling. The image of Samuel she had held onto for so long, the brave, honorable soldier, the man she had loved with all her heart, began to crumble, replaced by a question mark, a void filled with uncertainty and doubt. Who was Samuel Hayes? What had he been hiding? The possibilities were endless, each one more unsettling than the last. Was he a spy? A traitor? Had he been living a double life? The thought was unbearable, a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure his face, to remember the warmth of his smile, the strength of his embrace. But the image was blurred, distorted by the shadow of his secret. She felt a wave of nausea, a sickening feeling of disorientation. The world she thought she knew was shifting beneath her feet, threatening to swallow her whole. A sudden noise startled her. The flap of the tent was thrown open, and a figure silhouetted against the bright sunlight stood in the doorway. It was Dr. Moreau, his face grim, his voice urgent. "Nurse Hartley," he said, "we have another emergency. A transport just arrived. Heavy casualties. We need you immediately." Isabel blinked, momentarily disoriented. The world outside the tent, the world of war and suffering, seemed distant and unreal. But she knew she couldn't stay here, lost in her own turmoil. Duty called. She quickly folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, her heart heavy with unanswered questions. She stood up, her legs shaky, and followed Dr. Moreau out of the tent. The scene that greeted her was one of chaos and devastation. A convoy of trucks had pulled up outside the hospital, their beds filled with wounded soldiers. The air was thick with the screams of the injured, the shouts of the orderlies, the acrid smell of exhaust fumes and blood. Isabel forced herself to focus, to push aside her personal turmoil and concentrate on the task at hand. She moved quickly, assessing injuries, directing orderlies, providing what comfort she could to the terrified and suffering men. As she worked, she noticed a group of soldiers huddled around one of the trucks, their faces etched with concern. They were talking in hushed tones, their voices barely audible above the din. She approached them, curious. "What's happened?" she asked. One of the soldiers, a young corporal with a bandaged arm, looked up at her. "It's Sergeant Miller, ma'am," he said. He's not good." Isabel followed him to the back of the truck. Lying on a makeshift stretcher, his face pale and covered in sweat, was a man she recognized. Sergeant Miller. He had been brought in a few days earlier, with a relatively minor shrapnel wound to his leg. He had seemed to be recovering well. "What happened?" she asked again, her voice sharp with concern. He had a seizure," the corporal said. "He started talking, rambling about a fire. And a face. He kept saying he saw a face in the flames." Isabel's heart skipped a beat. A face in the flames. The phrase resonated with a chilling familiarity. She remembered the night Samuel had proposed to her, 2 years ago, in front of a roaring bonfire. The flames had danced in his eyes, reflecting the intensity of his love. She knelt beside Sergeant Miller, her mind racing. He was delirious, his eyes unfocused, his breathing ragged. She gently touched his forehead. He was burning up. "We need to get him inside," she said. "He needs immediate attention." As they carried him into the hospital, Sergeant Miller continued to mutter, his words fragmented and incoherent. But one phrase, repeated over and over, sent a shiver down Isabel's spine. Hayes, he saw it too, the face in the flames. Isabel stopped dead in her tracks, her blood running cold. Samuel. He was connected to this, somehow. The face in the flames, what did it mean? What had they seen? And what did it have to do with Samuel's secret? The image was a spark, igniting a new, terrifying trail of breadcrumbs through the smoky haze of war. She had to find out. The mystery was thickening. The fear, too. Chapter 5. Beyond the Barbed Wire. The phrase "face in the flames" echoed in Isabel's mind, a haunting refrain that overshadowed even the immediate chaos of the hospital. Sergeant Miller's delirium seemed to be a key, a twisted, fragmented clue to the mystery surrounding Samuel. But what did it mean? She spent the next few hours tending to the new wave of casualties, her hands moving automatically, her mind preoccupied. She couldn't shake the image of the fire, the face, Samuel's confession in the unsent letter. It all felt connected, a tangled web of secrets and half-truths. As the day wore on, she found herself drawn back to Private Baker's diary. She retrieved it from her pocket, the leather cover worn and stained, a tangible link to the mystery. She flipped through the pages, rereading the entries about Sergeant Hayes, searching for any clue she might have missed. She noticed something she hadn't paid much attention to before. In the entry where Baker described Hayes going out on patrol, he mentioned that Hayes had said it was important, something he had to do. He had also said Hayes wouldn't say more, just that it was a hunch. But there was a small, almost illegible scribble beneath that line, a word that had been partially obscured by a smudge of mud. Isabel held the diary closer to the light, squinting at the smudged word. She carefully scraped away the dried mud with her fingernail, revealing the letters beneath. The word was rendezvous. Rendezvous. A meeting. A secret meeting. But with whom? And where? The answer, she realized, likely lay beyond the barbed wire, in the no-man's land between the trenches, a desolate, dangerous landscape where secrets were kept and lives were lost. It was a place she had never dared to venture, a place that represented the ultimate unknown. But she knew she had to go. She had to find out what Samuel had been meeting about, who he had been meeting with. It was the only way to unravel the mystery, to understand his confession, to find out if he was still alive. The thought was terrifying. To leave the relative safety of the hospital, to venture into the heart of the war zone, was madness. But she couldn't ignore the pull, the desperate need to know the truth. She waited until nightfall. The hospital was quieter then, the sounds of suffering muted, the activity reduced to a low hum. She changed into a dark, nondescript dress, discarding her nurse's uniform. She took a small, leather pouch and filled it with a few essential supplies, a bandage, a bottle of antiseptic, a small knife. She also took Samuel's unsent letter, folding it carefully and tucking it into the pouch. It was a talisman, a reminder of her purpose. She slipped out of the hospital unnoticed, melting into the shadows. The night was dark, the moon obscured by clouds, the air thick with the smell of rain and smoke. She made her way towards the front lines, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. The closer she got, the more intense the sounds of war became. The distant rumble of artillery, the sporadic crackle of gunfire, the occasional scream that pierced the night. She walked along a deserted road, keeping to the shadows, her eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of movement. She reached the edge of the British lines, a network of trenches and barbed wire that stretched as far as the eye could see. She knew she couldn't go through the main lines. She would be stopped, questioned, turned back. She needed to find another way. She remembered seeing a small, abandoned supply path earlier in the day, a narrow track that led through a gap in the wire. It was used to bring supplies to the forward trenches, but it was rarely guarded at night. She found the path, her heart pounding in her chest. It was overgrown with weeds and strewn with debris, but it was passable. She carefully made her way through the gap in the wire, her breath caught in her throat. She was now in no man's land, a desolate, cratered landscape that separated the two armies. The ground was churned up by shellfire, littered with the debris of war, broken weapons, twisted metal, the skeletal remains of trees. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a grim reminder of the constant presence of death. She moved cautiously, keeping low to the ground, her eyes scanning the darkness. She had no idea where she was going, no idea what she would find. But she had to keep moving. She had to find the place where Samuel had his rendezvous. She walked for what seemed like hours, the silence broken only by the occasional burst of gunfire or the distant rumble of artillery. The landscape was a nightmare, a surreal, terrifying world of shadows and craters. She felt a growing sense of dread, a fear that threatened to consume her. Then she saw it. A faint flicker of light in the distance, a small, flickering flame that seemed to beckon her forward. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. Was it a trap? A German patrol? Or was it Samuel? She has to find the origin. The only way to do that is move forward, deeper into no man's land. Chapter 6. The Sergeant's Secret. The flickering light drew Isabel closer, a moth to a dangerous flame. She moved with agonizing slowness, every sense heightened, every muscle tense. The ground was treacherous, a minefield of hidden craters and tangled wire. The air grew colder, a damp chill seeping into her bones. The silence was almost unbearable, punctuated only by the frantic beat of her own heart. As she approached, the light grew stronger, revealing its source. It was a small, dilapidated shack, barely more than a pile of rubble, with a few walls still standing. A single candle burned inside, casting long, dancing shadows that flickered across the ruined walls. Isabel crouched low, peering through a gap in the crumbling stonework. She could see a figure inside, silhouetted against the candlelight. A man, sitting on a broken crate, his head in his hands. He was wearing a British uniform, but it was tattered and stained with mud. She couldn't see his face, but there was something familiar about his posture, the way he held himself. Her heart leaped into her throat. Could it be? Could it be Samuel? She hesitated, her mind racing. She had to be sure. She had to know if it was him before she revealed herself. She circled the shack, looking for another vantage point. She found a small, broken window, partially obscured by a piece of tattered canvas. She carefully pulled the canvas aside, her hands trembling. She peered inside. The man had lifted his head, and the candlelight illuminated his face. Isabel gasped, her breath catching in her throat. It was him.
Samuel.
But he looked different. Older, harder, his face etched with lines of weariness and pain. He was thinner, his eyes shadowed, his once bright smile replaced by a grim, haunted expression. But it was him.
Alive.
She wanted to call out to him, to rush inside, to throw her arms around him. But something held her back. The words from his unsent letter echoed in her mind. I am not who you think I am. What did that mean? What secret was he hiding? She watched him, her heart aching with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He was staring at the candle flame, his expression unreadable. He seemed lost in thought, miles away from the desolate shack in no man's land. Suddenly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver locket. He opened it, his fingers tracing the image inside. Isabel couldn't see what it was, but she knew. It was a picture of her, a small, faded photograph taken before the war, before everything had changed. He stared at the picture for a long moment, his expression softening, a flicker of the old Samuel returning to his eyes. He closed the locket, his hand lingering on the cool metal. He whispered something, his voice so low that Isabel could barely hear it. Isabel, hearing her name, spoken with such tenderness, such longing, broke through her hesitation. She couldn't stay hidden any longer. She had to talk to him. She had to know the truth. She pushed open the door of the shack, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. Samuel startled, his head snapping up, his eyes widening in surprise. He stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fear. Isabel? He said, his voice hoarse, questioning. Well, what are you doing here? She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on their faces. She looked at him, her eyes searching his, trying to find the man she had loved, the man she had mourned. I came to find you, she said, her voice trembling. I found her letter. The unsent letter. His eyes widened. You read it? She nodded. I had to. I had to know what you meant. You said you weren't who I thought you were. He looked away, his gaze falling to the floor. He took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping. It's a long story, Isabel, he said. A complicated story. I have time, she said, her voice firm. And I deserve to know the truth. He looked at her again, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and something else. Something that looked like shame. It started before the war. He began, his voice low and hesitant. Before I met you, I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. He paused, his gaze fixed on the dirt, the words escaping slowly, painfully. A mistake that cost a man his life, and I took his place. His name. His life. I am not Samuel Hayes. I was Thomas Ashton. The secret, spoken at last, hung heavy in the air, a suffocating weight in the small, ruined space. Chapter 7. Scars of the Somme. The name Thomas Ashton fell like a stone into the still pool of their reunion, sending ripples of shock and disbelief through Isabel. She stared at him, the man she knew as Samuel Hayes, her mind struggling to reconcile the familiar features with this new, alien identity. Thomas Ashton. It was a name she had never heard before, a name that belonged to a ghost, a man he claimed to have replaced. I don't understand, she said, her voice barely a whisper. You took his place?
How? Why?
Thomas looked up at her, his eyes filled with a deep, agonizing pain. The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on his face, highlighting the lines of weariness and guilt that had etched themselves onto his features. It was an accident, he said, his voice hoarse. A foolish, drunken brawl. We were both young, reckless. We argued, it escalated. I pushed him. He fell, hit his head. He died. Isabel felt a wave of nausea, a sickening feeling of disbelief. This couldn't be true. This couldn't be the man she loved, the man she had believed to be honorable and good. And you just took his identity? She asked, her voice trembling. You let his family believe he was dead? He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. I panicked, he said. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. His papers, they were on him. I switched them. I took his name, his regiment. I became Samuel Hayes. But the army, wouldn't they have known? Isabel questioned, grasping at straws, trying to find some flaw in his story, some reason to disbelieve him. It was chaos, he explained. The early days of the war, recruitment was frantic. Records were incomplete. They were desperate for men. No one questioned it. I was just another body, another name on a list. He looked up at her again, his eyes pleading for understanding. I never meant for it to go this far, he said. I thought I could just disappear. Start a new life. But then I met you. And everything changed. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. It was a familiar touch, the touch of the man she loved, but now it felt tainted, corrupted by his secret. I fell in love with you, Isabel, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I wanted to tell you the truth. So many times. But I couldn't. I was afraid. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of the consequences. He paused, his gaze searching hers. And then the war, it just consumed everything. There was no escape. No way out. I was trapped. Trapped in this lie. Isabel pulled her hand away, her heart aching with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and a lingering, undeniable love. She didn't know what to believe, what to feel. The Somme, she said, her voice trembling. You were reported killed. I saw the telegram, he nodded. I was wounded, he said.
Badly.
I was left for dead. But I survived. I woke up in a field hospital, under another name. Another assumed identity, covering for absence while I recovered in a different location.
It was a chance.
A chance to escape. To disappear again.
But you didn't, Isabel said.
You came back.
Why?
He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, profound sadness. Because of you, he said. I couldn't leave you. Not without telling you the truth. Even if it meant losing you forever. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket, the one with her picture inside. He opened it, his fingers tracing the faded image. This is all I have left of the life I wanted, he said. The life I could have had with you. If I had been a different man. He closed the locket, his hand clutching it tightly. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Isabel, he said. But I had to tell you. I had to be honest with you at least once. The raw honesty, the unveiled pain, left her adrift. He looked at her, waiting. The scars of the psalm were not just on his body, but carved deep into his soul. Chapter 8. Under a Shattered Moon. Isabel stood in the dilapidated shack, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, the silence punctuated only by the distant rumble of artillery. The man she had known as Samuel Hayes, now revealed as Thomas Ashton, sat before her, his face a mask of pain and regret. His confession hung in the air, a heavy, suffocating weight that threatened to crush her.
She didn't know what to say.
What to do? Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, anger, betrayal, confusion, and a lingering, stubborn ember of love that refused to be extinguished. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just the familiar features, but the lines of weariness and guilt, the haunted look in his eyes. He was a stranger, and yet he was also the man she had loved, the man she had shared her hopes and dreams with. I need time, she said, her voice trembling. Time to process all of this. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. I understand, he said. I don't expect you to forgive me. She walked towards the broken window, looking out at the desolate landscape of no man's land. The moon, partially obscured by clouds, cast a pale, ethereal light on the churned-up earth, the twisted wire, the skeletal remains of trees. It was a scene of utter devastation, a reflection of the turmoil within her own heart. Why did you tell me now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. After all this time? After I thought you were dead? He didn't answer immediately. He stood up and walked towards her, stopping a few feet away, respecting her need for space. Because I couldn't live with the lie any longer, he said, his voice low and strained. And because I saw you. In the hospital. I heard you talking to Private Baker. I knew you were looking for me. Isabel turned to face him, her eyes searching his. You were there? All this time? He nodded. I've been watching you. From a distance. Making sure you were safe.
But why? She asked.
Why not just disappear? Start a new life. Again? He shook his head. I couldn't, he said. Not without knowing that you were all right. Not without seeing you one last time. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. It was a familiar gesture, one that sent a shiver down her spine, a reminder of the intimacy they had once shared. I love you, Isabel, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I always have. And I always will. Even if you can never forgive me. Isabel closed her eyes, tears welling up and spilling down her cheeks. She wanted to hate him, to push him away, to erase him from her memory. But she couldn't. The love she felt for him, the bond they had forged, was too strong, too deeply ingrained in her soul. She opened her eyes and looked at him, her gaze filled with a mixture of pain and a flicker of hope. I don't know what to do, she said, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. I know, he said. And I don't blame you. But I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just asking you to understand. He paused, his gaze searching hers. I'm a different man now, Isabel, he said. The war, it's changed me. This secret, it's changed me. I'm not the man you fell in love with. But I'm still the man who loves you. More than anything in the world. A sudden burst of gunfire shattered the silence, a reminder of the war that raged around them, the constant threat of death that hung over their heads. Isabel looked at him, her heart torn. She didn't know what the future held, whether they had any future at all. But she knew one thing. She couldn't leave him here, alone in this desolate place.
Not yet. We need to go, she said, her voice firm.
It's not safe here. He nodded. Where will we go? He asked. Isabel didn't answer. She didn't know. But as she looked at him, standing there under the shattered moon, a flicker of determination ignited within her. She would find a way. They would find a way. Together. The path forward was veiled, obscured by the debris of his past and the ever-present dangers of the war, but she knew she couldn't turn back. She couldn't abandon him.
Not now.
Not ever. Chapter 9. The Price of Silence. The journey back to the hospital was a tense, silent trek through the darkness. Isabel led the way, her senses on high alert, her mind racing. She knew the risks they were taking. If they were caught, Thomas Samuel would be arrested as a deserter, possibly even a spy. And she would be implicated, her career, her reputation, her life, ruined. But she couldn't think about that now. She had to focus on getting them back safely, on finding a way to navigate this impossible situation. As they approached the British lines, she stopped, turning to face him. We can't go through the main entrance, she said, her voice low. You'll be recognized. We need to find another way in. He nodded, his expression grim. There's a small, abandoned storage shed near the back of the hospital, he said. It's rarely used. We might be able to get in through there. They made their way to the shed, moving cautiously through the shadows, avoiding the patrols and the sentries. The shed was dilapidated, the door hanging off its hinges, the roof partially collapsed. But it was secluded, hidden from view. They slipped inside, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. Isabel lit a small, oil lamp she had brought with her, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. We need to stay here for now, she said, until things quiet down, until I can figure out what to do. He sat down on a stack of broken crates, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. Thank you, Isabel, he said, for not turning me in. She shook her head. I don't know what I'm going to do, she said. But I couldn't just leave you there. She sat down opposite him, the small lamp casting a circle of light between them. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. What about the face in the flames? She asked, breaking the silence.
Sergeant Miller, he kept talking about it.
He said you saw it too. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. Miller? He's alive? Isabel nodded. He was brought in a few days ago. He's delirious. But he keeps mentioning a fire and a face. He closed his eyes, his face paling. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling. It was the night Thomas Ashton died, he said, his voice low and strained. The night of the brawl. We were near a bonfire. A large one. When he fell, he landed near the flames. I saw his face in the fire. It was horrible. It's haunted me ever since. He opened his eyes, his gaze locking with hers.
Miller, he was there that night, he said.
He saw it too. He was a friend of Ashton's. He knew what I had done. Isabel felt a chill run down her spine. He knew, and he kept silent? He nodded.
He threatened to expose me, he said.
Unless I paid him. He demanded money, a lot of money. To keep quiet. Blackmail, Isabel said, her voice filled with disgust. Yes, he said. I paid him what I could, but it was never enough. He kept demanding more. And then the war. It gave him leverage. He knew I couldn't refuse him. Not with the threat of exposure hanging over my head. He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor. That's why I went on that patrol, he said. Beyond the wire. I was supposed to meet him. He said he had information. Something that could clear my name. He said he had proof that Ashton's death was an accident. But it was a trap, Isabel said, her voice filled with a growing sense of dread. He nodded. I should have known, he said. I should have seen it coming. But I was desperate. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to be free. The price of silence, Isabel realized, was far greater than she could have ever imagined. It had cost Thomas his identity, his peace of mind, and nearly his life. and it had entangled her in a web of deceit and danger that she didn't know how to escape. The flickering lamp illuminated the despair on his face, and for the first time, she wondered if their love could truly survive the weight of his past. Chapter 10. A Dance in No Man's Land. The revelation of Miller's blackmail added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Isabel paced the confines of the dusty shed, her mind struggling to find a solution, a path forward that didn't lead to ruin. Thomas, she still struggled to think of him by that name, sat silently, his head in his hands, the weight of his past bearing down on him. "We need to find out what Miller knows," she said, breaking the silence. "What information he claimed to have. If there's any chance of clearing your name, we have to take it." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a flicker of hope, quickly overshadowed by doubt.
"But how?"
he asked. "He's in the hospital under guard. And if he reveals my secret, I'll talk to him," Isabel said, her voice firm. "I'll find a way. I'm a nurse, I have access. I can try to get him to talk." It was a risky plan, bordering on reckless. But she couldn't see any other option. She had to try.
For him. For them.
She waited until the early hours of the morning, when the hospital was at its quietest. She slipped out of the shed, leaving Thomas hidden inside, and made her way to the main ward. Sergeant Miller was in a private room, his condition still critical. He was heavily sedated, his breathing shallow and labored. Isabel entered the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She approached his bed, her gaze fixed on his pale, drawn face. She gently touched his hand. "Sergeant Miller," she said, her voice low. "Can you hear me?" He stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering. He opened his eyes, his gaze unfocused, clouded with pain and medication. "Hayes," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Hayes, he knows." Isabel leaned closer. "I know about Hayes," she said. "I know what happened. He told me everything." Miller's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition in their depths. He lied," he said, his voice strained. "It wasn't an accident." Isabel's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice urgent. "What wasn't an accident?" He struggled to speak, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The fire," he said. He pushed him into the flames. Isabel felt a wave of nausea, a sickening feeling of horror. This was worse than she had imagined. Much worse. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Are you sure you saw that?" He nodded weakly. I saw it all," he said. He killed him deliberately. He closed his eyes, his breathing becoming more labored. Isabel knew she had to get out of there. She had heard enough. Too much. She turned to leave, but then she noticed something on the bedside table. A small, crumpled piece of paper, partially hidden beneath a glass of water. She carefully picked it up, her hands trembling. It was a note, written in a hurried, almost illegible hand. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words. "Meet me tonight, no man's land near the old church. I have proof." Isabel's blood ran cold. The old church. She knew where that was. It was a ruined church, located in the heart of no man's land, a place of desolation and danger. It was where she had found Thomas. She looked back at Miller, his eyes now closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. He was in no condition to go anywhere. So who had written this note?
And why?
She realized, with a growing sense of dread, that she had walked into a trap. A trap set not for Thomas, but for her. She slipped out of the room, her mind racing. She had to get back to Thomas, to warn him. But as she stepped out into the corridor, she saw two figures approaching. Two military police officers, their faces grim, their expressions determined. They stopped in front of her, blocking her path. "Nurse Hartley," one of them said, his voice cold and formal. "You're under arrest for aiding and abetting a deserter." Isabel's heart sank. She had been betrayed. But by whom?
And why?
She knew she had to escape. She had to warn Thomas. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. The officers shouted after her, their boots pounding on the floor. She burst out of the hospital, into the darkness, her lungs burning, her heart racing. She headed towards the abandoned shed, her only hope. As she ran, she heard a familiar sound. A whistle, blowing shrilly in the night. A signal. A warning. It was coming from the direction of the shed. It was Thomas. She changed direction, heading towards the sound of the whistle. She saw him, standing in the shadows near the shed, his face pale and strained. He was motioning for her to follow him. They ran together, into the darkness, into no man's land, towards the ruined church. A desperate, impromptu dance under the shattered moon, a flight from a trap she didn't understand, led by a man she wasn't sure she could trust anymore. The note. Miller's accusation. It spun in her head, a vortex of doubt and fear, threatening to consume her. Chapter 11. The Spy Among Us. The ruined church loomed before them, a skeletal silhouette against the night sky, its shattered windows like empty eyes staring out at the desolate landscape. The whistle had ceased, replaced by the ever-present rumble of distant artillery and the sporadic crackle of gunfire. Isabel and Thomas, breathless and terrified, reached the relative shelter of the crumbling walls. "What happened?" Thomas asked, his voice urgent, his gaze scanning the darkness for any sign of pursuit. "Why were they after you?" Isabel quickly recounted her conversation with Miller, the accusation of deliberate murder, the note, the arrest. "It's a trap," she said, her voice trembling. "But I don't understand who said it."
And why?
Thomas looked at her, his face pale and drawn. "Miller, he was lying," he said. "I swear to you, Isabel. It was an accident. I didn't push him into the flames." I wouldn't. Isabel wanted to believe him, needed to believe him. But the doubt, planted by Miller's words, lingered in her mind, a poisonous seed that threatened to blossom into full-blown distrust. "Then who wrote the note?" she asked. "And why lure me here?" Thomas shook his head.
"I don't know," he said.
"But we need to get out of here. This place, it's not safe." As if on cue, a flare burst overhead, illuminating the landscape with an eerie, white light. They were exposed, vulnerable. "We need to find somewhere to hide," Isabel said, her voice urgent. "Somewhere they won't find us." Thomas pointed towards a section of the church where the roof had partially collapsed. "There's a crypt," he said, "underneath the floor. It's our only chance." They made their way to the collapsed section, scrambling over rubble and broken stones. They found the entrance to the crypt, a narrow, stone staircase leading down into darkness. They descended into the crypt, the air immediately becoming colder, damper, the silence absolute. Isabel lit the oil lamp she had brought, the flickering light revealing a small, stone chamber, lined with ancient tombs. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay, a chilling reminder of mortality. "We'll be safe here for a while," Thomas said, his voice echoing in the confined space. "No one knows about this place." They sat down on a cold, stone slab, the silence stretching between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Isabel looked at Thomas, his face illuminated by the flickering lamplight, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Something that looked like guilt. "Tell me the truth, Thomas," she said, her voice low and steady. "Tell me exactly what happened that night." "Everything. Don't leave anything out." He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. He took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping. He began to speak, his voice barely a whisper, recounting the events of that fateful night, the drunken brawl, the argument, the push, the fall. But this time, he added a detail he had omitted before. A detail that changed everything. There was someone else there, he said. Someone who saw it all. Someone besides Miller. Isabel's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" she asked, her voice urgent.
"Who was it?"
He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a deep, profound sadness.
It was a woman," he said.
"A woman named Annalise Dubois." Isabel gasped, her blood running cold. Annalise Dubois. The ward master's daughter. She had seen her around the hospital, a quiet, unassuming girl who helped with the laundry and the cleaning. She had never paid her much attention.
"But why?"
Isabel asked, her mind reeling. Why would she? She was in love with Ashton, Thomas said. She had been for a long time. She was jealous. Jealous of me, of anyone who got close to him. He paused, his gaze searching hers.
She saw what happened, he said.
And she used it. She threatened to expose me, just like Miller. But her price, it wasn't money. It was me. Isabel felt a wave of disgust, a sickening feeling of betrayal. Annalise, she had been using Thomas, manipulating him, controlling him. And now she had set a trap for Isabel, using the military police to eliminate her rival. She's the spy, Isabel said, her voice filled with a sudden, chilling realization. She's the one who's been passing information to the enemy. She's been using the hospital, using us to further her own agenda. The pieces clicked into place, a horrifying mosaic of betrayal and deception. Annalise, always there, always watching, always listening. A silent predator in their midst. Chapter 12. Betrayal at Dawn. The realization that Annalise Dubois was the spy, the architect of their current predicament, hit Isabel with the force of a physical blow. It explained so much. The intercepted messages, the suspicious casualties, the constant feeling of being watched. And most devastatingly, it explained the trap set for her, the calculated attempt to remove her from the equation. We have to warn them, Isabel said, her voice urgent, her mind racing. We have to tell someone, Dr. Moreau. Anyone? Thomas shook his head.
It's too risky, he said.
Annalise has connections. She'll know. She'll silence us before we can say anything. But we can't just do nothing, Isabel protested. People are dying because of her. I know, Thomas said, his voice filled with a grim determination. But we need proof. Something concrete. Something they can't ignore. He paused, his gaze fixed on the flickering lamplight. There's a hidden compartment, he said. In the administrative tent. Behind the bookcase. I saw Annalise accessing it once. I think that's where she keeps her information. Her contacts. Her plans. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. But it was their only chance. They waited until the first rays of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the crypt, painting the stone walls with a faint, gray light. They emerged from the crypt, stiff and aching, their senses on high alert. They made their way back to the hospital, moving cautiously through the shadows, avoiding the patrols and the sentries. The hospital was beginning to stir, the sounds of activity increasing, the air filled with the smell of coffee and antiseptic. They reached the administrative tent, the scene of Isabel's earlier search for the unsent letters. The tent was empty, the ward master, Madame Dubois, likely making her rounds. They slipped inside, the air thick with the scent of paper and ink. The bookcase stood against one wall, a large, imposing piece of furniture filled with medical texts and administrative records. Thomas approached the bookcase, his hands trembling. He ran his fingers along the back panel, searching for a hidden latch or a release mechanism. Here, he said, his voice low. I think this is it. He pressed a small, almost invisible button concealed within the intricate carvings of the bookcase. A section of the back panel clicked open, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside the compartment, they found a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. Letters, maps, coded messages, lists of names, all pointing to Annalise's elaborate network of espionage. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. This was the proof they needed. We need to get this to Dr. Moreau, she said, her voice urgent. He'll know what to do. But as they turned to leave, they heard a sound. A footstep just outside the tent. Someone was approaching. They quickly closed the compartment, their hearts racing. They looked around, searching for a place to hide. But it was too late. The flap of the tent was thrown open, and a figure stood silhouetted against the morning light. It was Annalise Dubois. And she was holding a gun. Going somewhere? She asked, her voice cold and menacing. Her eyes, usually so demure and unassuming, were now filled with a chilling, calculated fury. Isabel and Thomas were trapped. Cornered. The betrayal, stark and brutal, was complete. Annalise's face, framed by the early dawn light, was a mask of cold hatred, the final, devastating piece of the puzzle falling into place. The spy had been revealed, and their fate now rested in her hands. Chapter 13.
Echoes of Amiens.
Annalise stood in the doorway of the tent, the gun held steady in her hand, her eyes fixed on Isabel and Thomas with a chilling intensity. The early morning light cast long shadows, painting the scene with a stark, dramatic contrast. "I knew you'd come here," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth or emotion. "I knew you couldn't resist digging into things that didn't concern you." Isabel stood frozen, her mind racing, trying to find a way out of this impossible situation. Thomas stood beside her, his body tense, his hand instinctively reaching for the small knife hidden in his pocket. "Annalise, please," Isabel said, her voice trembling. "Put the gun down."
We can talk about this."
Annalise laughed, a cold, brittle sound that sent shivers down Isabel's spine.
"Talk," she said.
"There's nothing to talk about. You've seen too much. You know too much." She raised the gun, aiming it directly at Isabel. "You were always in the way," she said, her voice filled with a venomous hatred. "Always so noble, so righteous. But now you're nothing. Just another casualty of war." Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between Isabel and the gun. "Don't do this, Annalise," he said, his voice firm. "It's not worth it. You'll never get away with this." Annalise's eyes narrowed. "You," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You're a pathetic fool, Thomas. You always were. You think you're so clever playing the hero. But you're nothing. A liar.
A cheat.
A murderer." Her words struck Thomas like a physical blow. He flinched, his face paling. But he stood his ground, his gaze fixed on Annalise. "I made mistakes," he said, his voice low. "Terrible mistakes. But I'm not a murderer. Not like you." Annalise laughed again. "Oh, I'm not a murderer?"
she said.
"What about all those soldiers, those innocent boys who died because of the information I passed on? What about the bombing of Amiens? The countless lives lost because of me?" Isabel gasped, her blood running cold. The bombing of Amiens, it had been a devastating attack, a turning point in the war. And Annalise, she was responsible. "You're a monster," Isabel said, her voice filled with disgust. Annalise smiled, a cruel, twisted smile that sent chills down Isabel's spine. "Perhaps," she said. "But I'm a monster who's about to win." She took a step closer, the gun still aimed at Isabel. "Goodbye, Nurse Hartley," she said. "It's been interesting." Just as she was about to pull the trigger, a figure burst through the tent flap, tackling Annalise to the ground. The gun went off, the shot echoing through the tent, but the bullet went wild, embedding itself in the wooden frame of the bookcase. Isabel and Thomas stood frozen, stunned by the sudden turn of events. They looked down at the struggling figures on the floor. It was Madame Dubois, the ward master, wrestling with Annalise for control of the gun. Madame Dubois, despite her age, was surprisingly strong. She managed to wrench the gun from Annalise's grasp, throwing it across the tent. She pinned Annalise to the ground, her face red with fury. You treacherous little snake," Madame Dubois shouted, her voice filled with rage. "I always knew there was something wrong about you. But I never imagined." She looked up at Isabel and Thomas, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Well, what is going on here?" she asked. "What has she done?" Isabel quickly explained everything, recounting Annalise's espionage, her betrayal, her attempt to kill them. Madame Dubois listened in stunned silence, her face paling with each revelation. "My own daughter," she said, her voice trembling. "A spy, a murderer, I don't believe it." But the evidence was undeniable. The letters, the maps, the coded messages all pointed to Annalise's guilt. The military police were summoned, and Annalise was taken away, her face a mask of defiance and hatred. The echoes of Amiens, the devastating consequences of her actions, now reverberated through the small tent, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. The immediate danger was over, but the larger battle, the war within and without, was far from finished. Chapter 14. The Weight of a Promise. The aftermath of Annalise's arrest was a whirlwind of activity. The military police conducted a thorough investigation, uncovering the full extent of her espionage network and the devastating impact it had had on the war effort. Madame Dubois, heartbroken and ashamed, resigned from her position as ward master, unable to bear the weight of her daughter's betrayal. Isabel and Thomas were questioned extensively, their testimonies crucial in piecing together the puzzle of Annalise's treachery. They were cleared of any wrongdoing, but the experience left them shaken and scarred. The immediate danger had passed, but the underlying tension, the unresolved issues between Isabel and Thomas, remained. The revelation of Thomas's past, his deception, his assumed identity, had created a chasm between them, a divide that seemed impossible to bridge. They found themselves back in the abandoned storage shed, the place where their precarious journey had begun. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words, unanswered questions.
What happens now?
Isabel asked, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, profound sadness.
I don't know, he said.
I have to face the consequences of my actions. I have to atone for what I've done. You mean turn yourself in? Isabel asked, her heart sinking. He nodded. It's the only way, he said. I can't keep running. I can't keep living this lie. I have to make things right. Isabel felt a wave of despair, a crushing sense of loss. She had found him, only to lose him again. But she knew he was right. It was the only way. I'll go with you, she said, her voice trembling. I'll support you, whatever happens. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. It was a familiar touch, but now it felt different. It was the touch of a man facing his demons, a man seeking redemption. Thank you, Isabel, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But you don't have to do this. You don't have to tie yourself to me, to my mess. She shook her head. I made a promise, she said.
A promise to stand by you.
No matter what. And I intend to keep it. The weight of that promise, the commitment she had made, settled upon her shoulders. It was a heavy burden, but she would bear it.
For him.
For the love they had shared, the love that still flickered, however faintly, amidst the ruins of their past. They left the shed, walking hand in hand towards the military headquarters. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. It was a beautiful, bittersweet moment, a farewell to the life they had known, an embrace of an uncertain future. As they walked, Thomas stopped, turning to face Isabel. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, unwavering love. I know I don't deserve you, Isabel, he said. But I want you to know that loving you was the one true thing in my life. The one thing I never regretted. Tears welled up in Isabel's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. She reached up and gently touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines of weariness and pain. I love you too, Thomas, she said, her voice trembling. Or Samuel, whoever you are. I love the man you are now. The man who's trying to do the right thing. They continued walking, their hands clasped tightly together, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and hope. They didn't know what the future held, what trials and tribulations awaited them. But they knew one thing. They would face them together. Bound by a promise, forged in the crucible of war, tempered by betrayal, and ultimately, strengthened by love. The path ahead was uncertain, but their resolve was not. They would face the music, together whatever the cost. Chapter 15. In the shadow of the cathedral. The military headquarters was a stark, imposing building, a symbol of authority and order in the midst of the chaos of war. Isabel and Thomas stood before it, hand in hand, their hearts pounding in their chests. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the scene with a sense of finality, of impending judgment. They entered the building, the air immediately becoming colder, more formal. They were escorted to a small, sparsely furnished office, where a stern-faced officer awaited them. Thomas stepped forward, his shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on the officer. I am here to surrender myself, he said, his voice firm and clear. My name is Thomas Ashton. I am a deserter. And I have information regarding a case of espionage. The officer looked at him, his eyebrows raised in surprise. He listened intently as Thomas recounted his story, his assumed identity, his life as Samuel Hayes, his encounter with Annalise Dubois, the blackmail, the trap. Isabel stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm, providing silent support. She watched the officer's face, trying to gauge his reaction, his judgment. When Thomas had finished, the officer remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Thomas. Then he spoke. "Your story is extraordinary, Mr. Ashton," he said, "and frankly difficult to believe. However, we have corroborated your information regarding Miss Dubois. Her espionage activities are confirmed, and thanks to your testimony, several other members of her network have been apprehended." He paused, his gaze shifting to Isabel.
"Nurse Hartley," he said,
"Your bravery and your loyalty are commendable. You have played a crucial role in uncovering this conspiracy." Isabel felt a wave of relief, a sense of validation. But her joy was tempered by the uncertainty of Thomas's fate. The officer turned back to Thomas. "As for you, Mr. Ashton," he said, "your situation is complex. You have committed serious offenses. Desertion, impersonation, these are grave charges." Thomas nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I understand, sir," he said, "and I am prepared to face the consequences." However, the officer continued, "You have also provided invaluable assistance to the war effort. You have risked your life to expose a dangerous spy, and you have voluntarily surrendered yourself." He paused, his gaze softening slightly. "Under the circumstances," he said, "I am inclined to be lenient. I will recommend a court-martial, but I will also recommend a reduced sentence. Given the extraordinary circumstances and your cooperation, I believe you may be eligible for a pardon." Eventually, Isabel felt a surge of hope, a flicker of light in the darkness. A pardon, it was possible. It was a long shot, but it was possible. Thomas closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping with relief. He had faced his demons, confessed his sins, and he had been given a chance. A second chance. They were escorted to separate quarters, Thomas to a holding cell, Isabel to a small, sparsely furnished room. They were allowed a brief moment to say goodbye. They embraced, their bodies clinging together, their hearts aching with the pain of separation. "I'll wait for you, Thomas," Isabel whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "No matter how long it takes." He kissed her, a long, tender kiss that spoke of love, loss, and hope. "And I'll spend every day earning your love, your trust," he said. "I promise you." They parted, their hands lingering, their gazes locked. Isabel watched as Thomas was led away, his figure disappearing down the long, dimly lit corridor. She was alone again, but this time, she was not without hope. She had a promise to keep, a future to fight for. And she would not give up. She found herself drawn to the nearby town, a small, war-torn village dominated by a magnificent cathedral, its spire reaching towards the heavens, a symbol of faith and resilience amidst the destruction. She walked through the deserted streets, the silence broken only by the distant rumble of artillery. She entered the cathedral, the air immediately becoming cooler, quieter, the scent of incense and old stone filling her senses. The stained glass windows, miraculously intact, cast colorful patterns on the floor, illuminating the vast, empty space. She sat down on a wooden pew, her gaze fixed on the altar, her heart filled with a mixture of sorrow and hope. She prayed, not for miracles, not for divine intervention, but for strength. Strength to endure, strength to persevere, strength to keep her promise. In the shadow of the cathedral, surrounded by the echoes of centuries of faith and resilience, Isabel found a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to face whatever the future held. The weight of Thomas's past, the uncertainty of his future, still loomed large, but she was no longer afraid. She had love, she had hope, and she had a promise to keep. And that, she knew, was enough. Chapter 16.
Az túlen kis kuddai.
The days that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, military inquiries, and endless waiting. Isabel remained in the small town, taking a room in a modest boarding house near the cathedral. She visited Thomas every day, bringing him news, books, and small comforts, their conversations strained by the glass partition that separated them. The court-martial was swift and efficient. Thomas pleaded guilty to the charges of desertion and impersonation, but his testimony regarding Annalise Dubois's espionage and Isabel's corroborating evidence played a significant role in mitigating his sentence. He was found guilty, as expected, but instead of the harsh punishment that could have been imposed, he was sentenced to 5 years of military service, with the possibility of parole after 2, contingent on exemplary conduct. It was a far cry from a pardon, but it was a victory nonetheless, a testament to the officer's earlier words and the extraordinary circumstances of the case. Isabel was relieved, but the prospect of another 2 years, possibly 5, of separation loomed large, a daunting challenge to their already fragile relationship. The day before Thomas was to be transferred to a military prison, Isabel was granted a special visit, a private meeting without the barrier of the glass partition. She found him in a small, sparsely furnished room, his face drawn and weary, but his eyes still holding that spark of determination, that flicker of hope. They embraced, their bodies clinging together, the warmth of their reunion a stark contrast to the cold reality of their situation. "I'm so sorry, Isabel," Thomas said, his voice choked with emotion.
I've ruined everything.
She shook her head, gently touching his face. "You haven't ruined everything, Thomas," she said. "We'll get through this. Together." They sat down, their hands clasped tightly together. They talked for hours, sharing their hopes, their fears, their dreams for the future. They spoke of a life beyond the war, a life free from secrets and lies, a life where they could finally be together, without fear, without shame. As the time for their parting drew near, a sense of melancholy settled over them, a heavy weight in the small room. "I don't know when I'll see you again," Thomas said, his voice trembling.
"I'll visit you," Isabel said.
"Whenever I can. And I'll write to you every day." He smiled, a sad, bittersweet smile. "I'll cherish every letter," he said. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheekbones. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, unwavering love. "I love you, Isabel," he said. "More than words can say." "I love you too, Thomas," she whispered. He leaned in and kissed her a long, tender kiss that spoke of longing, regret, and a desperate hope for the future. It was a stolen kiss, a moment of intimacy snatched from the jaws of separation, a promise of a love that would endure, despite the distance, despite the time, despite everything. The guards came to escort Thomas away. They stood up, their hands lingering, their gazes locked. "Goodbye, Isabel," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Goodbye, Thomas," she replied, tears welling up in her eyes. He turned and walked away, his figure disappearing down the long corridor. Isabel watched him go, her heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and hope. It was a goodbye, but not a farewell. It was a stolen kiss, a promise whispered, a love reaffirmed. She left the military headquarters, walking back towards the town, towards the cathedral, its spire a beacon of hope in the gathering dusk. The war raged on, the future remained uncertain, but Isabel carried with her the memory of that kiss, the warmth of his embrace, the promise of a love that would, she believed, ultimately triumph over adversity. It was a fragile hope, but it was all she had, and she would cling to it, fiercely, until the day they could be together again. The weight of their shared secret was still present, but now it was balanced by the lightness of a shared future, however distant. Chapter 17. The Reckoning at Reims. 2 years passed. 2 long, agonizing years filled with letters, brief visits, and the constant ache of separation. Isabel continued her work as a nurse, transferring to a hospital in Reims, a city strategically located near the front lines and closer to the military prison where Thomas was serving his sentence. Reims was a city scarred by war, its magnificent cathedral bearing the marks of countless bombardments, its streets filled with the wounded and the displaced. But amidst the destruction, life persisted, resilience bloomed, and hope flickered. Isabel found solace in her work, in the small acts of kindness, the moments of connection with the suffering soldiers she cared for. She poured her heart and soul into her duties, finding a sense of purpose, a way to cope with the pain of Thomas's absence. She visited him as often as she could, their brief encounters a lifeline, a reminder of the love that bound them together, the future they were fighting for. They talked of their dreams, their plans, their hopes for a life beyond the war, a life where they could finally be together, free from the shadows of the past. Thomas, during his imprisonment, had dedicated himself to self-improvement, earning the respect of his guards and fellow inmates. He studied, he read, he worked tirelessly, determined to prove himself worthy of Isabel's love, worthy of a second chance. The news from the front lines was a constant roller coaster of victories and defeats, of hope and despair. The war dragged on, seemingly without end, claiming countless lives, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. Then, in the autumn of 1918, a turning point. The Allied forces launched a major offensive, pushing back the German lines, gaining ground, achieving significant victories. The tide of the war was turning. Isabel followed the news with a mixture of hope and anxiety. She knew that Thomas's parole hearing was approaching, and she prayed that the changing fortunes of war would work in his favor. One crisp, clear morning, she received a letter. A letter from the military authorities. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tore open the envelope, her hands trembling. The letter was brief and to the point. Thomas Ashton had been granted parole. He was to be released immediately. Isabel gasped, tears welling up in her eyes. He was free. He was coming home. She rushed to the military prison, her heart filled with a mixture of joy and trepidation. She waited outside the gates, her gaze fixed on the entrance, her anticipation almost unbearable. Then she saw him. He emerged from the prison gates, his figure silhouetted against the bright sunlight. He was wearing a simple, civilian suit, his military uniform discarded, his past life shed like an old skin. He looked at her, his eyes widening in recognition, a smile spreading across his face. He walked towards her, his steps hesitant at first, then gaining confidence, his pace quickening. They met halfway, their bodies colliding in a fierce embrace, their hearts overflowing with a love that had endured the trials of separation, the weight of secrets, the ravages of war. "Isabel," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Thomas," she replied, her tears flowing freely. They stood there, holding each other, oblivious to the world around them, lost in the joy of their reunion. The reckoning at Reims, the city of coronations, had brought not judgment, but redemption. The war was not yet over, but their personal battle, their struggle for love and forgiveness, had reached a turning point. A new chapter was beginning, a chapter filled with hope, with promise, with the possibility of a future they had almost lost. The scars remained, a reminder of the past, but they were no longer wounds, but rather marks of resilience, testaments to a love that had conquered all. Chapter 18. The General's Daughter. The weeks following Thomas's release were a period of adjustment, of rediscovering each other, of navigating the complexities of their new reality. They rented a small cottage on the outskirts of Reims, a quiet haven away from the hustle and bustle of the war-torn city. They spent their days exploring the countryside, taking long walks, sharing quiet moments, rebuilding the intimacy that had been fractured by time and separation. Thomas found work as a carpenter, his skills honed during his imprisonment, his hands creating beauty and order amidst the chaos. Isabel continued her work at the hospital, her days filled with the familiar routine of caring for the wounded, the constant reminder of the war that still raged, even as peace seemed within reach. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, sharing a simple meal, Thomas spoke of something that had been weighing on his mind. There's something I need to do, Isabel," he said, his voice hesitant. "Something I should have done a long time ago." Isabel looked at him, her eyes filled with concern. "What is it?" she asked. I need to see Ashton's family," he said. I need to tell them the truth. I need to ask for their forgiveness. Isabel's heart sank. She knew how difficult this would be, how painful. But she also knew that it was necessary. It was the final step in Thomas's journey of redemption, the final reckoning with his past. They traveled to Ashton's hometown, a small village in the English countryside, a world away from the battlefields of France. They found the address in Ashton's military records, a modest cottage on a quiet lane. They stood before the cottage, hand in hand, their hearts pounding in their chests. Thomas took a deep breath and knocked on the door. A woman answered the door, her face etched with lines of weariness and grief, her eyes filled with a lingering sadness. She was Samuel Ashton's mother. Thomas introduced himself, his voice trembling. "Mrs. Ashton," he said. "My name is Thomas Ashton. I have something to tell you about your son." Mrs. Ashton looked at him, her eyes narrowing, a flicker of suspicion in their depths. She invited them inside, the cottage filled with the scent of lavender and old memories, the walls adorned with photographs of a young, smiling Samuel. Thomas recounted his story, his voice breaking with emotion, his words filled with remorse and regret. He told her everything, the drunken brawl, the fatal accident, the assumed identity, the years of living a lie. Mrs. Ashton listened in stunned silence, her face paling with each revelation, her tears flowing freely. When he had finished, she remained silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on Thomas. "You took my son's life," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And then you took his name. You stole his future." Thomas nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I know," he said, "and I will never forgive myself. But I wanted you to know the truth. And to ask for your forgiveness." Mrs. Ashton looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger, grief, and something else. Something that looked like understanding. "My son, he was a good boy," she said. "But he wasn't perfect. He had a temper. He made mistakes." She paused, her gaze shifting to Isabel. "And you," she said. "You loved him even though you didn't know who he really was." Isabel nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I loved him," she said, "with all my heart." Mrs. Ashton stood up and walked towards Thomas. She reached out and gently touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines of his cheekbones. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said, "but I can try to understand. You were young. You were scared. And you have suffered for your mistakes." She paused, her gaze locking with his. "My son, he's gone," she said. "But you're here. And you're trying to make amends. That's all I can ask for." They left the cottage, their hearts heavy, but also lighter. They had faced the past, confessed their sins, and they had been met with grace, with understanding, with a glimmer of forgiveness. It was not a complete absolution, but it was a beginning. As they were walking away, they heard a voice calling out to them. They turned and saw a young woman running towards them. She was carrying a photograph, a faded image of a soldier in uniform. "Wait," she called out, her voice breathless. I heard what you said. About Samuel." She stopped in front of them, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm his sister," she said. "Sarah. And I want you to know I don't blame you. Samuel, he wasn't always easy. He and we had a difficult relationship with our father, the general." She looked at the photograph and handed it to Thomas. He would have wanted you to live your life, to be happy. The unexpected encounter, the words of forgiveness from Samuel Ashton's sister, felt like a final, unexpected blessing. The weight of the past, though still present, began to lift, replaced by a sense of peace, of closure. The general's daughter, a symbol of the family he had wronged, had offered him a path forward, a chance to finally leave the ghost of Samuel Hayes behind. Chapter 19. Flight from the Front. The armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918. The guns fell silent. The war was over. The news spread like wildfire, igniting a wave of jubilation, relief, and disbelief. People poured into the streets, cheering, singing, dancing, celebrating the end of the long, bloody conflict. Isabel and Thomas were in Reims when the news arrived. They joined the throngs of people celebrating in the streets, their hearts filled with a mixture of joy and sorrow. Joy for the end of the war, sorrow for the countless lives lost, the devastation wrought. But amidst the celebrations, a new challenge arose. The Spanish flu, a deadly pandemic, was sweeping across the globe, claiming more lives than the war itself. The hospitals were overwhelmed, the medical staff stretched to their limits, the streets filled with the sick and the dying. Isabel, despite her exhaustion, threw herself into the fight against the pandemic, working tirelessly to care for the afflicted, to comfort the dying, to provide what solace she could in the face of this new, invisible enemy. Thomas, too, volunteered his services, using his carpentry skills to build makeshift hospitals, to construct coffins, to assist in any way he could. They worked side by side, their love a beacon of hope amidst the despair, their strength a testament to their resilience. One evening, as they were walking home from the hospital, exhausted and emotionally drained, Isabel collapsed. She had been feeling unwell for days, but she had ignored the symptoms, pushing herself to keep going, driven by a sense of duty, a need to help. Thomas caught her as she fell, his heart filled with terror. He carried her back to their cottage, his mind racing, his fear growing with each passing moment. He laid her on the bed, her face pale and flushed, her breathing shallow and labored. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that she had contracted the flu. He cared for her tirelessly, day and night, using all his knowledge, all his skills, to try to save her. He brewed herbal remedies, he applied cool compresses, he whispered words of comfort and encouragement, his love a desperate prayer against the encroaching darkness. But the flu was a relentless enemy. Isabel's condition worsened, her fever rising, her breathing becoming more difficult, her strength ebbing away. One night, as he sat by her bedside, holding her hand, she opened her eyes, her gaze weak but focused. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He leaned closer, his heart aching with a pain he had never known before. "I'm here, Isabel," he said. "I'm here." She smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that lit up her face. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too, Isabel," he replied, his tears flowing freely. She closed her eyes, her breathing becoming shallower, her grip on his hand weakening. He held her close, his body trembling with grief, his heart breaking with the imminence of loss. Then she was gone. Thomas remained there, holding her lifeless body, his world shattered, his dreams turned to ashes. He had survived the war, he had overcome his past, he had found love, only to lose it all to this invisible, insidious enemy. He buried her in the small cemetery outside Reims, near the cathedral, a place she had loved, a place of peace and beauty amidst the destruction. He stood before her grave, a solitary figure in a landscape of loss, his heart filled with a grief that was beyond words. He would leave the war zone, a war veteran, a man seeking a new life, carrying loss. He decided he needed to go far from the front, away from the memories, the suffering. He has to rebuild, start anew. But how? And where? The war had taken everything, yet also had given him a second chance at life, a life he had almost thrown away. It was a bitter irony, a cruel twist of fate. Chapter 20. A Love Forged in Fire. Thomas left Reims, a ghost of the man he once was, haunted by the memories of war, betrayal, and loss. He carried with him only a small bag containing a few belongings, Isabel's letters, and the faded photograph of her that had been his constant companion throughout his ordeal. He had no destination in mind, only a desperate need to escape, to find a place where he could begin to heal, to rebuild his shattered life. He traveled south, away from the front lines, away from the devastation and despair. He walked, he hitchhiked, he worked odd jobs, his hands finding solace in the familiar rhythm of carpentry, his mind struggling to make sense of the chaos he had endured. He eventually found himself in a small, coastal village in the south of France, a place untouched by the war, a haven of peace and tranquility. The village was nestled between the mountains and the sea, its whitewashed houses clinging to the hillside, its narrow streets winding down to a picturesque harbor. He found work in a small boatyard, repairing fishing boats, building small craft, his skills honed by years of practice, his hands finding a rhythm that soothed his soul. He rented a small, simple room above a bakery, the scent of fresh bread filling his mornings, a small comfort in his solitary existence. He spent his evenings walking along the beach, watching the sunset, listening to the waves, his heart slowly beginning to heal, the raw edges of his grief beginning to soften. He wrote letters to Isabel, pouring out his thoughts, his feelings, his memories, addressing them to the empty air, to the spirit he believed still watched over him. He made friends with the local fishermen, the villagers, the shopkeepers, his quiet demeanor, his willingness to help, earning their respect and acceptance. He became a part of the community, a valued member of this small, close-knit world. One evening, as he was walking along the beach, he saw a woman sitting on a rock, gazing out at the sea. She was wearing a simple, white dress, her hair flowing in the gentle breeze. There was something familiar about her, something that stirred a memory, a flicker of recognition. He approached her, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. As he drew closer, he realized it was her. Isabel. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat, his eyes widening in disbelief. He couldn't speak, he could barely breathe. She turned and looked at him, her eyes widening in recognition, a smile spreading across her face. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of joy and disbelief. He rushed towards her, his arms outstretched, his heart overflowing with a love that had defied death, that had transcended the boundaries of time and space. They embraced, their bodies clinging together, their tears mingling, their hearts beating as one. It was a reunion beyond comprehension, a miracle beyond words. "But how?" he asked, his voice trembling. I saw you, I buried you," she smiled, a radiant smile that lit up her face.
"It's a long story," she said.
"A complicated story. But I'm here.
I'm alive.
And I'm with you," she explained, slowly, haltingly, the events that had transpired after he had believed her dead. The mistaken identity, the misdiagnosis, the slow, arduous recovery in a remote convent, the nuns who had nursed her back to health, the journey to find him. It was a story of resilience, of hope, of a love that had refused to be extinguished, a love that had been forged in the fires of war, tempered by betrayal, and ultimately resurrected by a miracle. They sat there, on the beach, hand in hand, watching the sunset, the sky ablaze with color, the sea reflecting the golden light. The world around them faded away, their past, their pain, their losses, all dissolving in the overwhelming joy of their reunion. They had found each other again, against all odds, their love a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a beacon of hope in a world scarred by war and loss. They had both been through their own personal hell, their own battles, but now, together, they could finally begin to heal, to rebuild, to create a new life, a life forged in fire, tempered by love, and blessed by a second chance. The village, untouched by war, offered a new beginning, a clean slate. It was a love story that had defied death, a testament to the resilience of the human heart. Epilogue. Years passed. The scars of war, both physical and emotional, slowly faded, replaced by the gentle patina of time. Thomas and Isabel built a life together in the small coastal village, their love a constant source of strength and comfort. They never forgot the horrors they had witnessed, the losses they had endured, but they chose to focus on the future, on the beauty and joy that life still offered. Thomas continued his work as a carpenter, his hands creating not just boats and furniture, but a home, a haven, a sanctuary for their love. Isabel, her health fully restored, found work as a teacher in the village school, sharing her knowledge and her compassion with the children, nurturing the next generation. They had children of their own, 2 sons and a daughter, each a testament to their enduring love, a symbol of hope and renewal. They raised them with kindness, with understanding, with a deep appreciation for the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing every moment. They often walked along the beach at sunset, hand in hand, their children playing in the sand, the sea a constant reminder of the journey they had taken, the obstacles they had overcome. They told their children stories of the war, not to glorify it, but to teach them about the importance of peace, of tolerance, of forgiveness. They grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year, their bond unbreakable, their spirits intertwined. They watched their children grow, marry, have children of their own, their family expanding, their legacy continuing. One evening, as they were sitting on their porch, watching the sunset, the sky ablaze with color, the sea reflecting the golden light, Thomas reached out and took Isabel's hand. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a love that had endured the test of time, a love that had conquered all. "We made it, Isabel," he said, his voice soft, his smile gentle. She smiled back, her eyes sparkling with tears of joy. "Yes, Thomas," she said. "We did." They sat there, in silence, their hands clasped tightly together, their hearts filled with gratitude, with peace, with a love that would last forever. The village, their sanctuary, was quiet around them. Their children and grandchildren were inside. The war was a distant memory, a shadow that had shaped their lives, but no longer defined them. They were home. They were together. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. The love forged in fire had become a love that would last in eternity. The end.